Shouldn't you be knitting instead of trading? The Duke sneered. He thought he'd won the argument. He didn't realize she had just shorted his entire shipping fleet. Society dictated that women belonged in drawing rooms, oblivious to the brutal reality of the exchange. The Duke of Ashbourne believed that lie. 6 months later, he wouldn't be mocking her. He'd be standing in the freezing rain, begging for the very advice he once ridiculed. Here is how a woman's quiet intellect brought an arrogant lord to his knees. The carriage smelled of damp wool and old leather. Outside, the London rain turned the cobblestones into a slick, treacherous mirror, reflecting the gaslight in smeared streaks of yellow. Genevieve sat in the gloom, a heavy ledger balanced on her knees. Her fingers, stained with a faint trace of black ink at the cuticles, ran down a column of numbers. "Baltic timber is up 3p on the pound," she said. Her voice was flat. She didn't look up. Oliver sat across from her, shifting uncomfortably. He was a clerk by trade, a nervous man with a receding hairline and a permanent sheen of sweat on his brow. He was also Genevieve's proxy. Since the Royal Exchange did not allow women on the trading floor, Oliver was her voice in the chaotic shouting pit of men who controlled the wealth of an empire. "The rumours suggest a blockade, Lady Genevieve," Oliver murmured, clutching his umbrella like a shield. "The brokers are panicking. They're buying up domestic iron instead. It's safe." "Panic is a tax on the foolish." Genevieve snapped the ledger shut. "There won't be a blockade. The Russians need our sterling too badly to freeze the ports. Sell the domestic iron while it's artificially high. Buy the Baltic timber. When the ships arrive on Thursday, the price will correct, and we will clear 12%. Oliver swallowed hard. 12%. Yes, my lady. And Oliver. Yes. Do not let them see you sweat. You are representing capital. Act like it. Genevieve turned her face to the rain-lashed window as Oliver stepped out into the downpour. She hated this. She hated the secrecy, the constant reliance on timid men to execute her strategies, the way she had to hide her brilliance behind a facade of genteel poverty. Her father had died 3 years ago, leaving her a ruined estate and a mountain of hidden debts. Society offered her 2 choices: marry a man who would tolerate her ruined finances or become a governess. Genevieve chose a third option. She learned the markets. She read the financial papers her father used to throw into the fire. She taught herself the brutal, unfeeling math of supply and demand. That evening, the math was the furthest thing from the minds of the guests at Lord Croft's dinner party. The dining room was stifling heavy with the scent of roasted mutton, expensive claret and cheap flattery. Genevieve sat near the lower end of the table, picking at her food. She was only invited to these things because her bloodline was old, even if her purse was supposedly empty. At the head of the table sat Nathaniel, Duke of Ashbourne. He was a man who took up space, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, with eyes the colour of a bruised winter sky. He possessed the careless arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his 30 years of life. Ashbourne didn't just inherit wealth, he multiplied it. He was currently the darling of the financial district, having just announced the formation of the Grand Northern Railway, a massive infrastructure project meant to connect the northern coal mines directly to the southern ports. "It is a matter of pure willpower," Nathaniel was saying, swirling the wine in his glass. "The terrain in the Pennines is difficult, certainly, but British engineering is unparalleled. We will blast through the limestone. The railway will cut transport times in half." The men at the table nodded sagely. The women murmured their polite awe. Genevieve stared at her plate. She knew the surveyor's reports for the Pennines. She had read them 3 weeks ago. "Limestone," she said. The word was quiet, but in the sycophantic lull that followed the Duke's pronouncement, it carried. Nathaniel stopped swirling his wine. He looked down the long mahogany table, his gaze settling on Genevieve. He looked faintly amused, like a mastiff examining a particularly bold mouse. "I beg your pardon, Lady Genevieve. Did you have a contribution regarding geological engineering?" A few men chuckled. Genevieve felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a sudden white-hot irritation. "I was merely thinking aloud, Your Grace," Genevieve said, keeping her voice even. "Limestone is porous. The water table in that specific region of the Pennines is exceptionally high this year due to the heavy spring rains. Blasting through it won't yield a stable tunnel. It will yield an underground river. The reinforcement costs alone will triple your initial estimates." Silence descended on the room. It was thick and deeply uncomfortable. A woman had just corrected a duke on his own enterprise. Lord Croft looked as if he might choke on his mutton. Nathaniel stared at her. The amusement slowly drained from his face, replaced by a cold, hardened pride. He leaned back in his chair, assessing her cheap silk gown, the distinct lack of jewels at her throat. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, a spinster clinging to the fringes of high society, desperate for attention. He offered a slow, patronizing smile. "A fascinating theory," Nathaniel said smoothly. "Tell me, did you read that in a ladies' periodical, or perhaps it came to you in a dream?" He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "I appreciate your concern for my ledgers, Lady Genevieve, but shouldn't you be knitting instead of trading in matters you cannot possibly comprehend? The exchange is a brutal place. We wouldn't want you to strain your delicate sensibilities." The laughter from the table was immediate. It was loud, barking, and cruel. Genevieve did not flinch. She looked at Nathaniel, memorizing the arrogant tilt of his head, the smug certainty in his eyes. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply picked up her wineglass, took a slow sip, and smiled. "You are entirely right, Your Grace," she said softly. "I shall leave the heavy lifting to the men." Genevieve left the Croft estate before the dessert course was cleared. She did not cry in the carriage ride home. She didn't curse Nathaniel's name or throw herself onto her bed in a fit of Victorian vapours. Instead, she walked into her study, lit the oil lamp, and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote a single direct note to Oliver. "Sell every share of the Grand Northern we hold, short the stock, use the entire margin, take the profits, and buy heavily into the Midland Canal Company. Do it at the opening bell." She sealed the envelope with a drop of red wax. Her hands weren't shaking. They were perfectly steady. Nathaniel's arrogance wasn't just insulting, it was a glaring market inefficiency. And Genevieve always capitalized on inefficiencies. The next few months were a masterclass in slow, agonizing ruin. It started quietly in the financial columns. A small delay in the Pennine blasting. A minor budgetary adjustment. Nathaniel's brokers assured the public it was a temporary setback. But Genevieve knew the math. Water and rock did not care about a duke's pride. By October, the reality of the limestone was impossible to hide. The tunnels were flooding faster than the steam pumps could clear them. Work halted. The labourers went unpaid and walked off the site. The cost to reinforce the tunnels with iron casings was astronomical, effectively wiping out the company's capital reserves. On a dreary Tuesday in November, the panic set in. Oliver stood near the back of the Royal Exchange, his collar soaked with sweat. The trading floor was a madhouse. Men in tailored suits were screaming, shoving waving handfuls of worthless paper. "Grand Northern selling at 40.30. Who will take 30? No one took 30. By the end of the day, the stock was trading at pennies. Meanwhile, the Midland Canal Company, the only other viable route for the northern coal, saw its stock price surge by 300%. Genevieve, sitting quietly in her parlour, darning a pair of old gloves, had quadrupled her net worth in an afternoon. Across town, Nathaniel stood in his sprawling, opulent office. The fire in the hearth was roaring, but he felt freezing cold. The large mahogany table, usually covered in neat, promising ledgers, was buried under a snowstorm of urgent telegrams and demand letters. Charles, his chief financial advisor, looked physically ill. The man had unbuttoned his collar and was rubbing his temples with trembling fingers. "It's gone, Your Grace," Charles whispered. "The credit lines are frozen. The Bank of England refuses to issue a bridge loan. We are over-leveraged on the iron casings. If we cannot secure a cash injection by Friday, the creditors will seize the shipping fleet to cover the railway debts." Nathaniel gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. There has to be capital somewhere, a private syndicate. Someone must be willing to buy out the debt at a discount. "I have asked everyone," Charles said miserably. "The market has completely dried up for this venture. The only entity with the liquidity to save us is, well, it's a phantom." Nathaniel frowned, his sharp features pulling tight. "What are you talking about?" "A private investor." Charles explained, shuffling through a pile of papers. "Operating through a proxy firm. They heavily shorted our stock months ago and bought up the canal routes. They made an absolute fortune off our collapse. They hold enough liquid capital to float the railway, but the proxy refuses to name the principal. He goes only by GW Investments. Find this GW." Nathaniel commanded, his voice tight with desperation. "Offer him 20% equity. Offer him a seat on the board. Whatever it takes." "I tried, Your Grace. I tracked the proxy. A clerk named Oliver. I bribed him." Charles hesitated, looking terrified. "He gave me the address of the principal." Charles slid a slip of paper across the desk. Nathaniel snatched it. He read the address once. He read it twice. The breath hitched in his chest. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a prestigious gentleman's club in Mayfair. It was a modest townhouse on a faded, unremarkable street. A townhouse belonging to Lady Genevieve. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The stuffy dining room at Lord Croft's, the quiet, flat voice. Limestone is porous. The water table. Blasting won't yield a stable tunnel. And then his own voice dripping with unearned superiority. "Shouldn't you be knitting instead of trading?" Nathaniel sank into his leather chair. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his own hubris crushed down on him. She hadn't just guessed. She had known. She had looked at the very same world he had through the exact same numbers. And she had seen the truth while his pride had blinded him. And then, when he mocked her, she had quietly bet against his ego. And she had won. He had to go to her. The thought made his stomach twist with nausea. He was a duke. He bowed to the Queen and no one else. To walk into that woman's house and admit that he was a fool to beg for her financial mercy to save his family's legacy. It was unthinkable. "Your Grace," Charles asked quietly. "What shall we do?" Nathaniel stared at the slip of paper. He thought of his grandfather who had built the shipping line from a single schooner. He thought of the hundreds of sailors and clerks who would lose their livelihoods if the Ashbourne estate went bankrupt. His pride was a heavy thing, but it was not worth the ruin of an empire. He stood up. "Get my coat, Charles." The London night was unforgiving. The rain had turned to a freezing sleet slashing sideways down the narrow streets. Nathaniel didn't take a carriage. He walked the final 3 blocks to her street, the icy wind biting through his wool overcoat, soaking his trousers. He needed the cold. He needed the punishment. He stood before the dark green door of her townhouse. There was a single light glowing in the front window. Through the gap in the curtains, he could see her sitting by the fire. She wasn't holding a ledger. She was with meticulous, calm precision knitting a scarf. Nathaniel raised his heavy, freezing hand and knocked on the door. The brass knocker felt like a block of ice against Nathaniel's bare hand. He struck it against the doorplate twice. The sound was swallowed instantly by the howling wind. He stood on the top step, water pooling around his expensive leather boots, waiting. He expected a butler, a footman, someone to announce him properly. Instead, the door was pulled open by a tired-looking woman in a plain grey dress. She held a single oil lamp, shielding the flame from the draught with a cupped hand. Martha Genevieve's housekeeper blinked at the looming figure in the darkness. She took in the ruined top hat, the sodden wool coat, the aristocratic jawline tense with cold. "I am the Duke of Ashbourne," Nathaniel said. His voice was gravelly, stripped of its usual booming authority. "I am here to see Lady Genevieve." Martha did not curtsy. She simply stepped aside, leaving wet boot prints on the cheap runner rug in the narrow hallway. "She is in the parlour, Your Grace. She said you would likely prefer to see yourself in." Nathaniel froze. "She said you would likely prefer to see yourself in." She had known he was coming. He stripped off his ruined gloves and dropped them on a side table. He didn't bother with the coat. The cold was sunk too deep into his bones. He walked down the short hallway and pushed open the parlour door. The room was small, heated by a robust coal fire snapping in the grate. The air smelled of dried lavender and roasting apples. It was a domestic, fiercely private space. Genevieve sat in a wing-back chair, angled toward the hearth. A basket of grey yarn rested at her feet. In her hands, 2 silver needles clicked together with rhythmic, maddening precision. She did not stop knitting when he entered. "You are tracking mud onto my Persian rug." "Your Grace," she said. Her eyes remained fixed on the scarf in her lap. Nathaniel looked down. A puddle of muddy rainwater was indeed forming around his boots, soaking into the faded red and blue wool. He didn't move. He couldn't. He stared at the woman he had dismissed as a desperate spinster. "The water table," Nathaniel said softly. "The limestone. You knew." "I read the geological surveys," Genevieve replied, finally pausing. She rested the needles on her lap and looked up. The firelight caught the sharp, intelligent angles of her face. "They were publicly available at the Ministry of Works. You simply chose to ignore them because they contradicted your ambition. You ruined me." "I did nothing of the sort." Her tone was completely conversational, devoid of malice. "Water and porous rock ruined you. Your own pride ruined you. I simply bet on the inevitable outcome of your arrogance. If a man insists on setting his own house on fire, it is not a crime to sell water to his neighbours." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He wanted to rage at her. He wanted to pull rank to remind her that he was a peer of the realm, and she was a penniless daughter of a dead earl. But he had no rank here. He had a flooded tunnel, a mountain of debt, and a ticking clock. He walked further into the room, stopping inches from the fire. He was shivering, though he tried violently to suppress it. "I need capital," he said, forcing the words through his teeth. "My advisors tell me GW Investments holds the only liquid reserves large enough to buy out my creditors before Friday. I am here to offer you 20% equity in the Grand Northern and a seat on the advisory board." Genevieve picked up her needles. Click, clack. "No." The single word hit him like a physical blow. 25%. It is an incredibly generous valuation considering your stock is currently worth less than the paper it is printed on, Genevieve interrupted. She let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh. "You do not seem to understand your position, Your Grace. You are not offering me a partnership. You are begging for a rescue, and 25% is not the price of a rescue." Nathaniel gripped the mantelpiece. The stone was warm, burning against his freezing palms. What do you want? 51%. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the snapping coal. Nathaniel stared at her, horrified. That is a controlling stake. You would own the railway. I would own the mess, Genevieve corrected sharply. I would be taking on the liability of your flooded tunnels and your panicked creditors. I will not pour my capital into a sinking ship unless I am the one steering it. It is my family's venture. I am the Duke of Ashbourne, and the Duke of Ashbourne is bankrupt, she stated, cold and unyielding. 51% of the Grand Northern, a primary lien on your shipping fleet to guarantee the loan, and you will execute the engineering pivot exactly as I dictated. You will abandon the direct route through the Pennines. That adds 12 miles to the track, he protested, and avoids the limestone basin entirely. She shot back. It will cost £40,000 to lay the extra track. It will cost £200,000 to case your current tunnel in iron. Do the math, Nathaniel. He flinched, not at the logic which was flawless, but at the use of his Christian name. She stripped away his titles, his wealth, his armor, leaving only the man who had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her spine was steel. Her mind was a trap. He had walked into the jaws of a predator and insulted her teeth. If I sign over the controlling stake, Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper, I am effectively your employee. Genevieve resumed knitting. The grey wool slipped smoothly over the silver needles. I suggest you read over the contracts carefully tomorrow morning at my solicitor's office, she said. Now, if you don't mind, you are ruining my rug, and I have a scarf to finish. I find it soothes the delicate sensibilities you were so concerned about. The transition of power was brutal, silent, and absolute. They did not sign the papers in Nathaniel's sprawling Mayfair offices. Genevieve insisted on neutral ground. They met in the cramped, dusty chambers of her solicitor in Chancery Lane. Outside, the London fog was thick, choking the streets in a haze of yellow smog. Inside, the atmosphere was even suffocating. Charles Nathaniel's advisor looked as though he were attending a funeral. He handed the heavy parchment across the oak desk with trembling hands. Oliver, standing rigidly behind Genevieve's chair, looked equally terrified, though he clutched a leather portfolio to his chest like a shield. Genevieve did not gloat. She read every line of the 50-page document. She spent 20 minutes debating a single sub-clause regarding the shipping fleet's insurance premiums. Nathaniel sat across from her, his arms crossed tight over his chest, watching her eyes track back and forth across the ink. She was merciless. She spotted a loophole Charles had tried to bury on page 34 that would have allowed Nathaniel to trigger a stock buyback within 2 years. Genevieve struck it out with a heavy dip of her pen. When she finally signed her name, Genevieve Winslow, the sound of the scratching nib felt deafening. The funds will be transferred to your creditors by 3 o'clock today, Genevieve said, blotting the ink. She stood smoothing the skirts of her dark navy walking dress. We convene at your offices tomorrow at 8 in the morning. Have the surveyor reports for the southern bypass route ready. Tomorrow is Sunday, Nathaniel noted. Then I suggest you pray for good weather while we review the logistics, she replied cleanly. The next morning, Nathaniel arrived at his own office to find it already occupied. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back to let in the weak winter light. His mahogany desk, previously a monument to his own importance, was buried under topographical maps and rolled canvas blueprints. Genevieve stood over them. She had discarded her hat and gloves. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She was tracing a route with a brass compass. Nathaniel closed the door, shutting out the nervous whispers of his clerks in the outer hall. You are early. You are bleeding capital. She didn't look up. Every day the workers sit idle, we pay for their lodging. Look here. She tapped a spot on the map. The bypass route cuts through the valley. It avoids the limestone, but it intersects with the property of Viscount Pendleton. We need right-of-way. Nathaniel stepped closer. The scent of her faint lavender and cold ink cut through the smell of his expensive cigars that usually dominated the room. Arthur Pendleton hates me. He won't sell. He doesn't have to sell the land. We just need the easement. Genevieve straightened, finally looking at him. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. Why does he hate you? Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably. I outbid him on a fleet of merchant vessels 3 years ago. It humiliated him. Good. Nathaniel frowned. How is that good? He will use this to exact his revenge. He will extort us for the easement, demanding a price that will wipe out the savings of the bypass route. Only if he knows we are desperate, Genevieve said. She walked around the desk, pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward her. If Pendleton realizes the Duke of Ashbourne is knocking on his door for a favor, he will bleed you dry, so you aren't going to ask him. Then how do we get the land? I will get the land, she said simply. GW Investments is purchasing a timber mill precisely 2 miles north of Pendleton's estate. It requires a heavy cart path directly through his valley to transport the lumber to the river. Pendleton doesn't care about a nameless proxy firm running a timber mill. He will sell the right-of-way for a fraction of what he would charge a railway. Nathaniel stared at her. It was a shell game, a brilliantly simple, devastatingly effective shell game. And once the easement is legally secured for the cart path, we lay steel instead of dirt. Genevieve dipped her pen. The contract will be written broadly to allow for industrial transport. By the time Pendleton realizes he leased his land to the Grand Northern Railway, our trains will already be running over it. He felt a sudden electric jolt in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was the thrill of the maneuver. For his entire life, Nathaniel had operated by brute force. He threw money at walls until they broke. Genevieve didn't break walls. She picked the locks while the guards were looking the other way. He watched her draft the letter to Oliver, instructing him on the Pendleton purchase. Her handwriting was sharp, aggressive, forward-leaning. "You are ruthless," Nathaniel murmured. Genevieve paused her writing. She looked up, holding his gaze across the span of the desk. The arrogance that usually lived in his bruised sky eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, reluctant awe. "I am a woman in a world built by men to keep me out," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. "Ruthless is the only currency they accept at the door. Now, Your Grace, sit down. We have 50 miles of track to reroute, and I want it done before lunch." The trap snapped shut on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Oliver returned to the Chancery Lane office, looking as though he had sprinted the entire length of the Strand. His overcoat was soaked, his bowler hat crushed in his grip. But the leather portfolio under his arm was perfectly dry. He placed it on the desk between Genevieve and Nathaniel. Genevieve unrolled the heavy parchment. The wax seal of Viscount Pendleton pressed heavily into the bottom corner, right next to his looping, arrogant signature. She read the document in silence. The room held its breath. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loud and rhythmic, marking the seconds of an empire hanging in the balance. Industrial transport of heavy goods, raw materials, and finished product across the valley basin. Genevieve read aloud, her finger tracing the ink. Granted in perpetuity to GW Investments and its subsidiaries. No restrictions on the mode of transport, provided the toll of 1 farthing. Per ton is paid quarterly. She let the parchment roll itself up with a snap. "He signed it," Nathaniel said. The reality seemed to stagger him. He actually signed it. He thought he was fleecing a provincial timber merchant, Genevieve replied. She slid the document toward him. Instead, he just gave the Grand Northern Railway the final link to the coast. Have Charles file the deed with the magistrate before the registry closes at 5. Tomorrow morning, move the grading crews into the valley. The sheer audacity of it left Nathaniel momentarily speechless. He looked from the deed to Genevieve. She was already opening a new ledger, her mind moving on to the next logistical hurdle. Iron prices, coal contracts, labour wages. The victory was secured, so she simply discarded it. The ensuing weeks were a grueling descent into the mechanics of industry. They worked out of Nathaniel's Mayfair office. The velvet curtains remained permanently drawn, shutting out the London social season. The massive mahogany desk became a battlefield of supply chains and engineering schematics. They did not speak of ball gowns or society gossip. They spoke of tensile strength, steam pressure, and the price of Welsh coal. Slowly, the dynamic shifted. Nathaniel stopped seeing the spinster in the faded silk dress. He started seeing the mind that drove the machine. Genevieve did not tire. She did not complain when the coal dust from the hearth ruined the cuffs of her sleeves. She calculated freight weights in her head, faster than Charles could write them down. When the iron workers in Sheffield threatened a strike over wages, Nathaniel wanted to fire them and hire scabs. Genevieve locked herself in a room with the union leaders and walked out 2 hours later with a 3-year contract that tied their bonuses to train punctuality. You gave them a raise, Nathaniel argued later, pacing the floor. I bought their loyalty, Genevieve corrected, not looking up from her paperwork. A scab will drop his hammer the second it rains. A man with a stake in the outcome will lay track in a blizzard. You cannot run a railway on resentment. It was a Tuesday evening in late February when the first crack in Nathaniel's armour truly showed. The fire had died down to embers. The office was freezing. Genevieve was hunched over a stack of invoices, her hand cramping around the pen. She had been there since dawn. She didn't notice Nathaniel leave the room. She only noticed when he returned and placed a steaming cup of tea directly over her open ledger. She blinked, staring at the delicate porcelain cup. Drink it, Nathaniel said. He didn't return to his side of the desk. He pulled up a chair beside hers close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his wool coat. He picked up the top invoice, studying the figures. You look like a corpse, Genevieve, he said. His voice was rough, completely lacking its usual aristocratic polish. It was the first time he had used her Christian name without the title. She didn't correct him. She picked up the tea. It was strong black and heavily sugared. She let the heat thaw her frozen fingers. The structural iron for the bypass bridge is delayed at the foundry, she said, her voice raspy from exhaustion. If it doesn't arrive by the 14th, the grading crews will hit a bottleneck. I will ride to the foundry tomorrow and threaten the foreman, Nathaniel said. He took the pen from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a sharp, involuntary jolt through her wrist. Her hands were stained with ink, the nails filed short. They were the hands of a worker. Nathaniel looked at them for a long moment. I mocked you, he said softly. The silence of the sprawling office pressed in around them. At Croft's dinner party, I humiliated you. Yes, Genevieve agreed. She didn't sugarcoat it. You did. You could have let me drown. He turned his head to look at her. The bruised sky eyes were no longer arrogant. They were hollowed out by fatigue, stripped down to an intense, terrifying honesty. You had your fortune. You made it off my stupidity. You could have stayed by your fire and knit, while the creditors tore my family's legacy to pieces. I like fixing broken things, she said evenly. Am I one of the broken things? The question hung in the air, dangerously intimate. Genevieve looked back at the ledgers. The numbers were safe. The numbers made sense. The sudden suffocating gravity pulling her toward the Duke of Ashbourne did not make sense. "You are a poorly managed asset," Genevieve replied, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. "I am simply optimizing my investment." Nathaniel let out a low, rough laugh. He didn't push it. He simply dipped her pen into the inkwell and began checking her arithmetic. They worked in silence until midnight, side by side in the dark. Spring arrived in London with a cruel, mocking brightness. The social season roared back to life, oblivious to the soot and sweat of the industrial north. Lord Harrington's annual spring gala was the first major event of May. The ballroom was a sea of pastel silks, glittering diamonds, and suffocating hypocrisy. The champagne flowed, hiding the fact that half the men in the room were living on credit, terrified of the very markets they pretended to control. Genevieve stood near the potted palms, practically invisible, in a dark, modest plum gown. She attended only because it was necessary to observe the brokers in their natural habitat. Drunk men shared secrets. Across the room, Nathaniel was surrounded by a sycophantic crowd. The Grand Northern Railway was no longer a laughingstock. The Southern Bypass route had laid 10 miles of track in a single month. The rumours of a mysterious financial backer had saved his credit rating. He was once again the golden boy of Mayfair. He looked miserable. His eyes scanned the crowd, dismissing the heiresses vying for his attention. When his gaze finally caught Genevieve's by the palms, the tension in his shoulders visibly dropped. He gave her a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. A silent acknowledgement. "We are in this together." The moment was shattered by Viscount Pendleton. Pendleton shoved his way through the crowd, his face purple with rage. He was a large man, accustomed to intimidating his way out of problems. He did not care about social decorum. He cared that he had been played for a fool. "Ashbourne!" Pendleton bellowed. The music faltered. The polite chatter died instantly. "You lying aristocratic thief!" Nathaniel turned slowly. He did not flinch. He handed his champagne flute to a passing waiter. "Keep your voice down, Arthur. You are frightening Lord Harrington's spaniels." "Do not patronize me," Pendleton snarled, closing the distance. "I rode out to my valley yesterday. I expected to find a cart path. Instead, I found 300 navvies laying steel rails across my property. You bought that easement under false pretenses." The crowd murmured, edging closer like wolves smelling blood. "I bought nothing," Nathaniel said smoothly, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom. GW Investments secured the easement. The contract clearly stipulates industrial transport. A train is an industrial transport. "It is fraud," Pendleton spat. "I will file an injunction tomorrow. I will have the magistrate tear up the tracks. I will freeze your mysterious little backer's accounts, whoever the coward is hiding behind a proxy." "You will do no such thing." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the heavy air like a razor. Genevieve stepped out from the shadows of the palms. She didn't hurry. She walked with the measured, terrifying calm of a woman holding a royal flush. Pendleton glared at her. "Stay out of this, Lady Genevieve. This is men's business." Genevieve stopped a few feet from the Viscount. She didn't look at Nathaniel, who was watching her with a mixture of apprehension and dark, thrumming pride. "It is my business, Viscount," Genevieve said, "because I am GW Investments." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. It was an involuntary sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Lord Croft spilled his drink down his waistcoat. Several dowagers looked as if they might require smelling salts. Pendleton let out a bark of laughter. "You, a spinster playing with ledgers, do not insult my intelligence." "I wouldn't dream of insulting something so thoroughly microscopic," Genevieve replied evenly. She reached into her small reticule and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. This is a certified copy of the Chancery filing. It establishes me as the sole principal of GW Investments. I hold the controlling 51% stake in the Grand Northern, and I hold the deed to your valley. Pendleton stared at the paper. The colour drained from his face. This cannot be legal. It is airtight, Genevieve said, stepping closer. The softness was gone. She was pure, cold steel. If you file an injunction, I will countersue for breach of contract. I will drag you through the courts for a decade. I will bankrupt your estate in legal fees alone. And while you are liquidating your assets to pay your solicitors, my trains will still be running across your land. She lowered her voice, meant only for him, but in the dead silence it carried. Go home, Viscount. You sold the land. Cash the cheque and lick your wounds in private. If you attempt to halt my railway, I will ruin you. And unlike the Duke, I will not feel a shred of remorse doing it. Pendleton opened his mouth, closed it, and looked around. The society that usually backed him was staring at Genevieve in horrified awe. He had been thoroughly, publicly dismantled. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the ballroom. The silence lingered for a beat too long. Then Nathaniel did something unimaginable. He crossed the floor, stopped in front of Genevieve, and bowed deeply. It was not a polite nod. It was the formal, rigid bow a man gives his superior. My chairman, Nathaniel said, his voice ringing out. My partner. Genevieve looked at him. The arrogant Duke was gone. In his place stood a man who finally understood the exact worth of the woman standing before him. Now, Your Grace, Genevieve said, ignoring the hundreds of staring eyes. If the dramatics are quite finished, we have a coal schedule to review. The morning after the gala, London society reacted exactly as Genevieve predicted. They closed ranks. The invitations to garden parties and afternoon teas ceased immediately. Women who had once tolerated her presence in their drawing rooms now crossed the street when her carriage approached. A woman might be poor and society would pity her. A woman might be wealthy and society would court her. But a woman who possessed the intellect to ruin a man and the ruthlessness to do it publicly was a monster. Genevieve did not care. She had traded the suffocating drawing rooms of Mayfair for the brutal, thrilling reality of the boardroom, and she found the air much easier to breathe. By late July, the office they shared had become a sanctuary. The heavy velvet curtains were permanently pinned back, allowing the harsh summer sun to bleach the expensive carpets. The mahogany desk was scarred by compass points and spilled ink. They operated in a state of synchronized exhaustion. Nathaniel had changed. The arrogant posture that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a lean, hardened focus. He no longer issued commands. He asked for calculations. When he looked at Genevieve, he didn't see a scandal. He saw the only person in London who understood the crushing weight of the empire they were trying to build. It happened on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. Genevieve was standing by the window, reviewing a manifest for timber sleepers. The heat in the room was oppressive. She had discarded etiquette entirely. Rolling the sleeves of her cotton blouse past her elbows, a smudge of soot stained her jawline. Nathaniel sat at the desk, his waistcoat unbuttoned, staring at a telegram that had arrived 5 minutes prior. He hadn't spoken since he opened it. The Baltic shipment is delayed again, Genevieve asked, not looking up from her manifest. No, Nathaniel's voice was hollow. It lacked its usual resonance. It's Harrison, the foreman at the viaduct. Genevieve turned. The viaduct was the crown jewel of the southern bypass, a massive stone and iron bridge meant to span the deep gorge of the River Derwent. It was the final, critical piece of the railway. If the viaduct wasn't finished by October, they would miss the winter coal contracts, and the 51% controlling stake would mean absolutely nothing. They would both be bankrupt. "What is it?" she asked, dropping the manifest. Nathaniel looked up. His eyes were bleak. "The eastern foundation is sinking. The heavy rains last week saturated the embankment. Harrison says the moment they load the first iron span, the entire structure will collapse into the river. He has halted work." The silence in the room was absolute. The grandfather clock ticked indifferent to their ruin. Genevieve didn't gasp. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She walked to the desk, pulled the structural blueprints from a towering pile of rolled canvas, and spread them flat. She pinned the corners down with inkwells. "Show me," she demanded. Nathaniel stood beside her. He traced a finger over the eastern support columns. "Here. The bedrock is deeper than the surveyors estimated. We built on compressed shale. When it's dry, it holds. When it's saturated, it turns to grease." Genevieve stared at the intricate grid of lines and numbers. Her mind raced violently, calculating variables. Time, money, gravity. She had beaten the Bank of England. She had beaten the exchange, but she could not bribe gravity. "We need to drive timber piles deeper," she said, her voice rapid, mechanical. "Past the shale, down to the absolute bedrock. Then we pour a concrete jacket around the base to displace the water weight." "We don't have the timber," Nathaniel replied quietly. "And we don't have the time. Pumping the water out to pour the concrete will take 6 weeks. The winter contracts expire in 5. Then we buy more pumps. We run them day and night." "Genevieve!" Nathaniel caught her hand. The physical contact jolted her. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely grounding. He stopped her frantic tracing over the blueprint. She looked up at him. The exhaustion in his face mirrored her own. "Harrison's men are walking off the site," Nathaniel said softly. "They are terrified. 2 men nearly drowned yesterday when the trench wall collapsed. They won't risk their lives for a daily wage, and I will not force them into a death trap. The mathematics won't save us this time." Genevieve felt a cold spike of panic. It was a new sensation. She was entirely comfortable manipulating abstract numbers, moving invisible capital across the globe. But this was real. Men were bleeding. Mud was shifting. Iron was bending. She pulled her hand from his grip, not out of rejection, but out of necessity. She needed her hands to think. She gripped the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. "Panic is a tax on the foolish," she whispered to herself. It was the same mantra she had given Oliver months ago in the carriage. It felt flimsy now. "I am going north," Nathaniel announced. He began buttoning his waistcoat. "I have to see the gorge myself. I will pay off the men, secure the site, and inform the creditors that the Grand Northern has failed. I will assume the liability. I will ensure your initial capital is returned before the banks seize the assets." He was offering to fall on his sword to protect her money. The arrogant Duke was entirely dead. Genevieve looked at the blueprint. She looked at the man who was willing to lose his legacy to save her ledger. "No," she said. Nathaniel paused, his coat half on. "You will not assume the liability," Genevieve said, her voice hardening into steel. "We are partners. I own 51% of that sinking mud, and I do not accept failure." She turned to the door. "Martha, pack my heavy boots. We are catching the 4 o'clock train to Derby." The Derwent Gorge was a scene of industrial hell. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the sprawling construction camp into a treacherous swamp of thick grey mud. The roar of the swollen river below was deafening, a constant, terrifying reminder of the valley's power. Genevieve stepped out of the hired carriage. The hem of her heavy wool skirt immediately dragged in the muck. She didn't hesitate. She walked directly past the bewildered, soot-stained navvies who had stopped packing their tools to stare at the woman invading their camp. Nathaniel was right beside her, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. They found Harrison the foreman in a canvas tent that smelled of wet dog and cheap tobacco. He was a large, bearded man who looked as though he hadn't slept in a week. When Nathaniel entered, Harrison offered a grim, exhausted nod. When Genevieve followed, the foreman froze. "Your Grace," Harrison grunted, eyeing Genevieve with deep suspicion. "This is no place for a lady. The embankment is giving way. She is the primary shareholder of this railway, Harrison," Nathaniel stated flatly. "Address your reports to her." Harrison swallowed heavily. He pointed to a crude map tacked to a wooden board. "The shale is liquefying, ma'am. The eastern pylons dropped 2 inches overnight. If we load the iron span, it all goes into the river. The men are done. I cannot ask them to dig out the trench when the walls are collapsing." Genevieve stood at the table. She looked at the muddy boots of the men outside the heavy steam pumps, sputtering and choking on the grit. The math was useless here. This required something else entirely. "How many men are left?" she asked. 100, Harrison replied. 200 have already walked to the tavern in town to wait for their severance. Bring them back. Genevieve's voice was sharp enough to cut the damp air. "Send riders. Tell them the Grand Northern will pay triple wages for every hour worked in the trench." Harrison shook his head. "Money won't stop the trench from caving in on them, ma'am." "No," Genevieve agreed. "Timber will." She turned to Nathaniel. "The Baltic shipment we delayed, it's sitting in the Manchester rail yard, isn't it?" "Yes." Nathaniel said, his brow furrowing. "But it's meant for the northern sleeper tracks. It's imported oak. It's obscenely expensive." "I don't care if it's carved from solid gold," Genevieve snapped. "Telegraph Manchester. Reroute the entire shipment to this gorge immediately. We will use the oak to shore up the trench walls. It won't snap under the mud pressure." She turned back to Harrison. "Triple wages, hot meals every 4 hours. And you tell them the Duke of Ashbourne and Lady Genevieve will be standing at the edge of that trench with them. If it collapses, it takes the owners with it." Harrison stared at her for a long, quiet moment. He looked at Nathaniel, who gave a single firm nod. The foreman grabbed his oilskin hat. "I'll send the riders." The next 48 hours blurred into a waking nightmare of mud steam and screaming iron. The Baltic oak arrived at dawn. Genevieve did not retreat to the carriage. She stood on the precipice of the gorge, wrapped in a filthy oilskin coat, a stopwatch in her hand, timing the rotation of the steam pumps to maximize the water extraction. She calculated the timber bracing angles on a slate board, wiped clean with her sleeve. Below her, Nathaniel was in the trench. He had stripped off his tailored coat. He was covered in grey muck to his chest, driving the heavy iron spikes into the oak, bracing alongside the men he employed. He didn't issue orders. He swung a sledgehammer until his hands bled. The men saw the Duke bleeding in the mud with them, and they stopped looking for the exit. They dug. By midnight on the second day, the trench was fully shored. The pumps had cleared the water. The concrete was poured. The eastern foundation held. Genevieve sat alone in the foreman's tent. The rain battered the canvas roof in a relentless rhythm. A small tin stove radiated a weak, localized heat. She was shivering uncontrollably, her boots caked in thick, drying mud. Her hands were bruised, the knuckles scraped raw. The tent flap pushed open. Nathaniel stepped inside. He was unrecognizable. The polished aristocrat of Mayfair was entirely gone. His face was streaked with soot and dirt, his shirt torn at the shoulder. He looked exhausted, brutalized and triumphant. He didn't say a word. He walked to the tin stove, grabbed a ragged towel, and knelt on the dirt floor in front of Genevieve's chair. He took her frozen, muddy hands in his own. He began to wipe the dirt from her skin, his touch incredibly gentle, despite the blisters on his palms. Genevieve watched him. Her chest tightened. It was a suffocating, terrifying feeling, entirely divorced from logic. "The concrete is curing," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The drop rate is 0. It held." "I know," Nathaniel said softly. He kept cleaning her hands, tracing the lines of her knuckles. "We are over budget by £40,000, she added, trying desperately to cling to the numbers. The numbers were safe. The triple wages, the oak. It was a severe miscalculation of resources. Nathaniel stopped. He let the towel drop to the dirt. He looked up at her, his bruised sky eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Stop," he said. The word was a quiet plea. "Stop counting Genevieve, just for a minute." He didn't move away. He stayed on his knees, closing the distance between them. "I spent my entire life thinking I was the center of the world because of an accident of birth." Nathaniel said, his voice rough and low. "I thought power was something you inherited. I was wrong." He reached up his thumb, gently brushing a streak of mud from her cheekbone. "Power is sitting in this chair. Power is a woman who looked at a broken, arrogant man and decided to build something out of the wreckage." Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs. "Nathaniel." "I don't just respect you," he said. The confession was grounded, factual, and devastatingly real. "I don't just need your mind for this company. I need you. I cannot build a world without you in it. I don't want to." He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't assume her surrender. He simply laid his truth bare in the mud and the cold. Genevieve looked at the man kneeling before her. She had spent her life guarding her independence, weaponizing her intellect against a world that wanted her to knit quietly in the corner. But looking at Nathaniel, she realized she no longer needed armor. She had found an equal. She leaned forward, burying her hands in his dark, soot-stained hair, and kissed him. The kiss tasted of rain, cold tea, and absolute certainty. When he pulled her down into his arms, the ledgers finally ceased to matter. The morning of November 12th smelled of frost and burning coal. Winter had stripped the trees bare along the Derwent Gorge, leaving a jagged, brutalist landscape of grey rock and frozen earth. Where there had once been only mud panic and a sinking trench, a monument of iron and stone now cut aggressively across the sky. The viaduct was finished. Mayfair had descended upon the bleak northern valley out of morbid curiosity. A specially chartered passenger train had brought the investors, the lords, and the gossiping dowagers from London. They stood clumped together on the safe side of the embankment, shivering in their sable coats and clutching silk umbrellas against the threat of snow. They expected a disaster. A quiet, spiteful part of them hoped for one. A woman had usurped their natural order, humiliated their peers, and dictated terms to a duke. They wanted gravity to punish her for it. Genevieve ignored them. She stood near the edge of the boarding platform, completely detached from the aristocratic vultures behind her. She did not wear festive silk. She wore a heavy charcoal-grey travelling suit tailored sharply to her frame. The hem deliberately shortened to avoid the industrial grease of the rail yard. Her hair was pinned tightly beneath a dark felt hat. She held a silver pocket watch in her bare hand, her thumb tracing the engraved casing. "The boiler pressure is holding at 140 pounds, Nathaniel said, stepping up beside her. He was dressed impeccably in a dark overcoat, but the careless, lounging posture of the man he used to be was gone. He stood with the grounded, alert tension of a man who knew the exact cost of the ground beneath his feet. "Harrison has the coal cars loaded to maximum capacity," Genevieve noted, snapping the watch shut. 300 tons of dead weight. If the Eastern Foundation has even a millimetre of give, we will feel it the second the engine reaches the centre span. Lord Croft detached himself from the huddled crowd of aristocrats and approached them. He was coughing into a gloved hand, eyeing the massive, steaming locomotive with deep suspicion. "Well, Ashbourne," Croft said, his voice carrying a forced, patronizing cheer. "I suppose congratulations are in order, provided the beast doesn't plunge into the river. A risky gamble loading it so heavily for the inaugural run." He looked entirely at Nathaniel, purposefully cutting Genevieve out of the conversation. Nathaniel didn't smile. He didn't offer a polite platitude. He looked at Croft with cold, dead-eyed calculation. The structural integrity and load-bearing limits were calculated by Lady Genevieve Croft. Nathaniel said, his voice slicing through the cold air. "If you have concerns regarding the engineering, you may address them to the principal shareholder, though I doubt you possess the mathematical literacy to understand her answer." Croft bristled, his face flushing a violent shade of plum. "Yes, well, highly unusual circumstances. Profit rarely cares about your comfort, Lord Croft," Genevieve said. She didn't bother looking up at him. She kept her eyes on the locomotive. "The winter coal contracts are already signed. If you did not buy shares on Friday, you are already too late." Croft opened his mouth, thought better of it, and retreated to the safety of the dowagers. Genevieve turned to Nathaniel. "Shall we?" They did not board the luxurious velvet-lined passenger cars at the rear. They walked to the front of the train and climbed directly into the cramped, blistering heat of the engine cab. Harrison, his face black with soot, gave them a sharp nod and pulled the release valve. The steam whistle shrieked. It was a terrifying, triumphant sound that echoed off the walls of the gorge. The ground shuddered. The massive iron wheels began to turn, biting into the steel rails. Genevieve grabbed the brass railing as the locomotive lurched forward. The heat from the firebox was intense, smelling of sulfur and hot oil. They rolled onto the viaduct. The noise was deafening. 300 tons of iron and coal suspended 200 feet in the air. Genevieve stared down at the frozen river far below. The timber and concrete foundation they had built in the mud was now hidden beneath the waterline, bearing the crushing weight of their ambition. She held her breath. She waited for the groan of buckling iron. She waited for the sickening drop of failing masonry. It didn't come. The engine glided across the center span with brutal, flawless efficiency. The tracks did not shift. The foundation held perfectly. As they reached the western embankment, hitting solid ground, once more a roar erupted from the rail yard ahead. Hundreds of navvies, the men who had bled in the trench with them, threw their caps into the air, cheering until their lungs gave out. Nathaniel reached out and covered her hand on the brass railing. His grip was tight, anchoring her in the chaotic noise of the cab. She looked up at him. His bruised sky eyes were shining with a fierce, unapologetic joy. He didn't need to say a word. The ledger was balanced. The victory was absolute. 2 weeks later, the Chancery Lane office was quiet. Oliver stood by the door, clutching his portfolio, trying desperately not to look at the two people sitting across from each other at the heavy oak desk. The fire crackled in the grate. The Grand Northern Railway stock had tripled in value that morning. Nathaniel slid a thick-bound document across the desk toward Genevieve. She picked up her reading glasses. "I thought we finalized the shipping integration yesterday. What is this?" "Read it," Nathaniel said simply. He leaned back in his chair, watching her. Genevieve opened the cover. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text. It wasn't a corporate merger. It was a marriage settlement. She read the clauses carefully, her brow furrowing. It was the most bizarre, legally aggressive document she had ever seen. Clause 4. Lady Genevieve retains absolute and sole autonomy over GW Investments and all capital therein. Clause 5. The Duke of Ashbourne entirely renounces all legal claims rights of coverture and managerial oversight regarding the financial assets of his wife. She lowered the document. She looked at Nathaniel. The quiet intensity in his face made her pulse hammer against her ribs, but her voice remained perfectly level. "You are proposing a merger," she said. "I am submitting to a hostile takeover," Nathaniel corrected softly. "I cannot offer you protection, Genevieve. You don't need it. I cannot offer you wealth. You already possess it. I can only offer you a partnership, equal shares, no proxies, no hiding in the shadows." Genevieve looked down at the parchment. Society dictated that a marriage was the end of a woman's independence. Nathaniel had just handed her a legally binding guarantee of her freedom, written in the only language they both truly respected. She picked up her pen. She dipped it into the inkwell. 50-50 equity," Genevieve murmured, tapping the nib against the glass to clear the excess ink. "In all things," Nathaniel promised. Genevieve signed her name with a sharp, forward-leaning stroke. She pushed the document back across the desk, a genuine rare smile breaking across her face. "Then I suggest we get to work, Your Grace. The market opens in an hour, and that is how Lady Genevieve broke the rules, built an empire and won the heart of an arrogant duke on her own terms. If this story of industrial romance and ruthless intellect kept you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you deeply human, fiercely grounded historical dramas every week. Share this video with a friend who loves strong, brilliant heroines who don't wait to be rescued. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Genevieve's brilliant revenge? See you in the next story.